Hello, everyone. It's Kat with Catworm Photo. Thank you very much for tuning in. So, today's video focuses on changing those overblown, overexposed photos like this to something like this. So, without further ado, let's go into the presets panel of Adobe Lightroom. I'm going to first enhance the portraits just a little bit, and probably even more so by reducing the amount to 75. Before, after. Again, it's really all about subtle changes at this point. So now I'm going to go under the basics panel and I'm going to start with the temperature and then I'm going to work my way all the way down to the saturation. A little bit warmer tones, and then I'm going to neutralize that tint a little bit by sliding the bar to the right. Now for the exposure, as you can see, it's really overexposed. I'm going to work with the extremes first by sliding the bar all the way to the left and finding a comfortable setting somewhere in the middle. And then for the contrast, when working with portraits, I find that less contrast is better because it provides more detail for the photo, but then it also does not affect the skin color as much, or I should say the skin tone. There are ways to counterbalance that, as you'll see. One of these ways is the shadows. So we're going to add more shadows into this mix. Let's say maybe around -35. We'll counterbalance the reduction in highlights by adding some white to it. Not so much though. So again, I'm working with the extremes, starting with the extreme right and work my way back into the middle. Another way to counterbalance that reduction in contrast is by adding blacks to it. And for me, one thing that I do like to do with all of my photos is I'll reduce the texture a little bit, but then I'll pop the clarity. I don't know why I do that. I just like the aesthetic that it provides, and so I'm going to go with it. Dehaze at this point for overblown, overexposed photos is key. So let's dehaze this portrait. And then for the vibrance, again, for portraits, I use the vibrance more so than the saturation because it does not affect the skin tone as much. Now, here's the fun part, or not so fun part, depending on who you are. The tone curves are key. Tone curve adjustments provide more control. They can be a little bit more intimidating for people. So the more comfortable you get, quicker, the better. So with that, I just lifted the shadows a little bit and I want to pop more brightness onto the subject, which in this case is myself several years ago. So we're going to then adjust for the colors. Right now we're adjusting for the red and the green. And I'm just finding a comfortable setting as far as the skin tone. Now, one thing that a lot of photographers like to do when editing, they like the S-curve. And the S-curve does provide pretty ideal results, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do it all the time. I am a firm believer that rules are meant to be broken if you want to be intentional. And so it really just depends on your comfort level, whether you're conservative or bold. Tone curve adjustments are really subjective, so just play around with it, get comfortable with it. Now, right now, I'm doing the green. What I'm doing at this point is I'm making very similar adjustments to each of the colors RGB. I do find that that helps to even out the overall portrait. And again, with these tone curves, for me, minor adjustments, subtle adjustments make all the difference. Okay, so I think we're good with the tone curves at this point. The portrait at this point is looking a little bit flat, so I'm going to add some contrast to it. And then we're going to go into the color mixer Lots of times I'll desaturate the orange just a little bit. And again, it's all about counterbalance. So if I desaturate the orange, then sometimes I'll go in and saturate the red just a little bit. Yellow, I don't think that it makes a difference in this portrait, so I think we're just going to leave that alone. Now, for the blue and the aqua, I'm not feeling the walls. I'm not feeling the color of these walls. I think they're just, I think the blue in this case is kind of tacky. So, more than likely, I'm going to desaturate this a little bit and see what we can do to change up the color. When you are doing color mixing, you have to be very cognizant of color theory. So, if you do have a good familiarization with color theory and how colors work, how colors complement each other, then that's going to add to your benefit. What I am focused on is how these colors complement the skin tone of the subject. So, now the real fun begins with color grading. One trick that I like to do, at least it does help me to not get overwhelmed with all of the various combinations of colors. When doing the color grading, with shadows, I'll start from the outer perimeter of the color wheel, again, working with the extremes. And then when I find a color that I might resonate with, then that's when I'll slowly make my way to the center of the wheel. Usually that's where I find my comfortable setting, and I'll do that for all of the wheels, the shadows, the highlights, the midtones, and then the global. And again, what I'm doing here is I'm trying to find a complementary color to my skin tone. So I'm taking all of the various parts of the portrait, the background, and of course, the subject into consideration. I want colors that complement each other. I don't want colors that actually bleed into one another. So contrast is definitely key here, but subtle. Now let's go to the global. Again, we're doing the same thing, working our way from the outer perimeter of the wheel and then working our way back in. I think the blues are a little too blue, so I think I might go for something a little bit warm or violet. Now, in this situation, I feel like I'm really close, but just no cigar. So I think with very, very minor tweaks like this, it's good to utilize your slide bars of the color grading wheel. And that way you can actually see the more combinations and you have more control over it versus just scrolling around the wheel itself. Okay, I think we're pretty good. We're just about there. Detail, I'm not going to denoise. I think it's fine as it is. I always do the lens corrections. No lens blur. Um, a lot of times I'll pop grain into my photo. At this point, I think I'm just going to just leave it alone. But if you are looking for more of a vintage look, then yeah, definitely play around with the grain. Calibration is another way to have more control over the colors. So I'm going to slide the tint bar probably to the right a little bit. I think that's good. And then the primary hues for the reds, we'll make these adjustments too. Again, the objective is to make me look alive. I don't want to look dead. I don't want to look desaturated. But at the same time, I want it to look natural. So the calibration section is going to give you a lot more control in addition to the tone curves, the color mixer, and the color gradings. All right, I'm going to brighten it up just a little bit. And then one other thing that you can do, because there is a lot of unnecessary space here, specifically above my head. So I'm going to reduce that just a little bit. And in turn, that's going to also reduce the unnecessary brightness from the flash to the right of my hair. Also, in situations like this, pay close attention to the rule of thirds. Again, I do think that rules are meant to be broken every now and then, but for this particular portrait, I'm just going to leave traditional norms um, considered. So, again, I do think that the contrast is needed, so I'm going to play around with the contrast and the blacks a little bit more. And I think we're pretty good. Again, I want this to look as natural as possible. So I'm trying to balance out the contrast with the brightness of the photo. Before, after. Okay, another thing that you can do. So this is pretty good as is, but another thing that you could do if you want to add a little bit more contrast between the subject and the background is you can go in and add a separate layer mask, specifically selecting the background itself. I'm going to go ahead and darken the background a little bit. That way the subject stands out a little bit more. But I also need to be cognizant of how natural it looks. Because unless you go into Photoshop and make really refined adjustments to the perimeter of the hair, the hairline, you're going to have this halo effect. The program's not going to pick up all of the adjustments, all of the colors, specifically through multiple strands of hair. So I can't make any significant adjustments to the background just because of that. At this point, it's just a matter of experimenting what looks best with the subject. A lot of this is also very, very subjective, but as you can tell, or as you can see, playing with the separate layer masks for the subject and also for the background adds more control. So we could have definitely stopped just a few seconds ago without doing any layer masks, but I just am very, very curious to see what else that we can do by changing up the background specifically. Right now, I'm utilizing the point color mixer um, to just try and see what we can do for the color of the background. Um, Again, I want the background to not conflict with my skin tone. So I'm just trying to see how we can neutralize the background a little bit. Before, after.